Ganz herzlichen guten Abend von mir. Ich bin Mareike Wittler vom Goethe-Institut in Dänemark und zusammen mit den anderen Goethe-Instituten in der Region Nordwesteuropa machen wir ja in diesem Jahr das Vorzeichenprojekt Wen, was und wie wir lesen. Einige von euch haben hoffentlich oder von Ihnen haben hoffentlich schon davon gehört, waren schon bei der einen oder anderen Online-Veranstaltung dabei oder haben auf der Webseite darüber gelesen. Ziel unserer Reihe ist es hier gemeinsam Kanonkritik zu praktizieren, indem wir den Fokus auf das machtkritische Lesen legen. Und es ist die zweite Online-Lecture, die wir jetzt haben, nachdem der erste Vortrag von Janette Ohuli schon im April stattgefunden hat. Und ich bin sehr, sehr froh, dass wir mit unserem Gast Ervin Malakaj heute auch sehr über den deutschen Tellerrand hinausschauen, kann man sagen. Ich möchte aber auch gar nicht zu viel reden. Eigentlich möchte ich ganz, ganz herzlich unsere Kuratorin Maha El-Hissi auch begrüßen, die das Gespräch heute wieder führen wird und auch noch ein paar Worte zum Projekt sagen wird. Außerdem ist Anna von Rath heute als Co-Moderatorin dabei von Pokolit. Zu der werden Sie auch gleich noch ein paar Sätze hören. Und noch ganz schnell von mir der Hinweis, nach Ervins Vortrag können Sie sehr, sehr gerne Fragen stellen und dazu am besten die sogenannte Q&A-Funktion nutzen oder in der deutschen Zoom-Version heißt es F&A oder F&A, unten in der Symbolleiste unter dem Bild. Genau, und damit würde ich dann das Wort an Maha übergeben.
I'll start by switching to English
Right.
because the talk and the whole evening is going and the discussion are all going to be in English. And I would like to again say welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here. This is the second lecture after Janette Oholi's first talk about how to bring in chaos and disorder into the canon. And Janette Oholi discussed with us how to read a joint archives of Black authors and all authors of color in Germany. It is such a pleasure to have Ervin Malakaj and Anna von Rath here with us today. And I'm going to start by perhaps briefly telling everyone a kind of like a few sentences about my own experience while I was writing my dissertation in Germany at the University in Munich. I was writing about migration, precisely about Turkish-German migration after the fall of Berlin Wall. And I chose to focus or to approach the texts via a post-colonial scope. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been asked about this kind of approach. How come in German studies I choose to work via a post-colonial lens? This was part of my PhD interview in order to get accepted in the PhD program in the first place. And it was a couple of years later, part of my PhD defense. I always had to defend how come I am approaching German, Turkish writing from a post-colonial perspective. This is perhaps part of a certain, I would say, mix of resistance and resentment from the side of German studies to really delve into colonial writing and post-colonial writing and to acknowledge that it is indeed part of the focus on German literature. And it is one of the main reasons while thinking about canon critique and while practicing it within the frame of this series, I thought Pokolit will definitely be the right co-host for this series. Like, first of all, I definitely thought that post-colonial studies and the history of colonialism must be included as part of this series. There will be a reading in fall that will focus on the colonial past, on writing about Germany's colonial past. And this time with Pokolit, and let me quote their website, they define Pokolit as a platform for post-colonial literatures in the broadest sense. So basically, it is not just about a mere linear colonial relation between a so-called colonizer and colonized, but it is actually the scope and the focus of post-colonial studies in general, which is to transcend this linearity and to think about things in a more transnational, transcultural, global context. It is such a pleasure to have this event as a cooperation together with Pokolit. And I would like to start by welcoming and introducing the co-host Dr. Anna von Rath, who's the co-founder of POCOLIT. Anna, it was such a pleasure to have you agreed on co-hosting this event together with me, because as you see, a large and huge basic fundamental pillar would have been missing if this wouldn't be taking place together with POCOLIT. Anna, you live in Berlin, and we briefly chatted about your career, and you said you actually were a scholar of English literature, but your PhD was a comparative reading of literature in London and in Berlin. So you are perhaps also a comparatist and a Germanist as well. Among many other things, you're also a translator, and you've been working on translating post-colonial literature from English into German. And it is such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for agreeing to host this event together with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for this warm introduction, and also a warm welcome to everyone from my side. I'm so happy to be here with you all. And yeah, as you said, I have a background in English and American studies, and that was also how I got introduced to post-colonial studies. And with POCOLIT, our intention is basically to make post-colonial literature more visible in Germany. And for that purpose, we very often highlight literature that has been translated into German, as well as literature that we think that should be translated into German. And so I'm very much looking forward to tonight's lecture, which will be on literature in and not of Germany.
Which also brings me to the protagonist of this evening, and it is such a joy and pleasure to introduce Ervin Malakaj. Ervin, I'll start by saying that you've just arrived in Cologne a couple of days ago for a longer stay within the frame of a research residency in Germany. So I'll start by saying, by welcoming you to the webinar, but also to Germany and to Cologne. Ervin, you're an associate professor of German studies at the University of British Columbia, and also an award-winning scholar, teacher, and community organizer. You work at the intersection of German cultural history and queer studies. You currently hold an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship for Advanced Researchers at the University of Cologne's Erich Auerbach Institute for Advanced Studies, and a Canada Council for the Arts grant for a book proposal, for a book of personal essays on queer life in the diaspora of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ervin, I think you're globally known also as the co-founder of the Solidarity Scholarly Research Network, Diversity, Decolonization, and the German Curriculum, also known as the DDGC. And I think everyone has been curious to find out more and more about, perhaps also even more outside Germany than in Germany, but everyone has been very curious to find out about founding such a solidarity network that is focused on collaborative, transnational, transatlantic scholarly work that transcends the corpus of canon and that looks beyond very established methods, that brings scholars from different backgrounds together. I think we'll probably take it all further at a certain point. And as a last thing to mention right now, which is also one further reason why I'm really pleased to have you here, while conceptualizing the series and while curating some of the readings, I was thinking I do not wish to read contemporary German literature without literature from post or from former Yugoslavia. This is indeed a narrative that is usually excluded while also talking about memory culture in Germany. And it was such a pleasure when I opened the forum and asked you if you could accept my invitation to be here. It was such a pleasure to learn that this is indeed the focus of your talk. Ervin, the floor is all yours. I'm very excited and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to always be in conversation with you, Maha. As you know, we go way back, and it's just such a treat. Anna, it's great to meet you. Want to thank you both for having me here, but I also want to thank the staff at the Goethe Institutes at Denmark and Sweden. I know you all have been doing quite a lot of work. Mareike, thank you so much for all the support in bringing me here. I think the series is just absolutely incredible. Offers quite a lot of new opportunities for scholars such as myself and many, many others to find access points into conversations, which all of us have been kind of leading on the margins, even when no one was paying attention to us. But now it's kind of nice to see that there is a little bit broader of an interest, even in our current time, which seems to be this really bizarre time where, in particular in Germany, scholarship of post-colonial studies is under pretty direct threat. So platforming post-colonial studies in such a fashion is a really important endeavor. So I am also very excited to be here because I've been reading, thinking about this incredible Bosnian writer translated into German, Lana Bastašić, for quite some time, and I never had quite the forum to share some of my ideas. And this is it's like the perfect venue for it. So Maha and the team, I just want to again shout out, thank you so much for creating this venue for me, but also for others. It's really good to be in this great company of intellectuals and artists who are thinking along very similar lines. So I want to begin with telling you a little bit of a story of how I came to Lana Bastašić's work, which I actually only started to very seriously get to know last summer, so the summer of 2023. I was in Vienna for a research trip and met a lot of Bosnian diaspora folks there, all of whom were raving about Lana's work. And everyone was telling me about how they were transformed by reading her Liečni zubi, so her collection of short stories that in German came out under the title of Mann im Mond. I was just absolutely riveted to see so many people just in unison be excited about a Bosnian writer. But then when I left Vienna and in Berlin, then Munich, and then I was also in Cologne last summer, every time I would encounter other diaspora, Bosnian diaspora people, post-Yugoslav diaspora people, but also people who lived in these cities, they would be very excited to tell me about Lana Bastašić. And I found that very exciting for many reasons. One of them being my own sort of positionality as a person who was born in the former Yugoslavia. I'm a Bosnian. I was born into a Bosnian Muslim family. I'm a queer person living in a diaspora. And to hear a Bosnian writer be talked about so fondly just really resonated with me. I walked into the first bookstore in Germany that I could find, thinking, surely her books must be on the shelves. And Lord, I was very astonished to find entire sort of towers of display that are featuring Bastašić's work, which is not something that I usually encounter. In particular, since there seems to be on the German literary market only room for like one writer at a time from a particular cultural background. And Sasha Stanisic, who's incredible, had been kind of taken up that place, but since I hadn't really taken much note of it. So I was very astonished to find a writer from Bosnia translated into German, which is different from Sasha Stanisic's work, who writes in German. But so a writer from Bosnia was translated into German to be so present on the German literary market. And this presence just every time, so I did a little bit of a sort of bibliographic, ethnographic study in Cologne, where I would go to different bookstores to see which bookstores would hold the texts by Lana Bastašić. And every single one I walked into kind of put her up on this pedestal and was celebrating her work. It really warmed my heart. So I instantly purchased the 2 books on display that one could find in Germany in 2023. The first one is a novel, Fang den Hasen, which was published in 2021. It's her debut novel, for which she received quite a lot of international praise, and her short story collection, Mann im Mond, from 2023. Both had initially appeared in Serbian and in Bosnian, respectively, before they were absolutely masterfully translated into German by Rebecca Zeinzinger. I also had the books in Bosnian. A good friend of mine from Sarajevo had sent them to me. But I have this really complicated, diasporic personal history, which makes the texts in German translation feel a little bit more accessible to me than the original ones. And I'm actually struggling with this idea as I was writing about this, and I'll be glad to talk about this in a Q&A if it comes up. So the books that I had in their original felt a little bit more distant to me than those books that were translated into German and made available for a sort of German language public. So I started reading these books in German. Immediately after the first chapter of reading Fang den Hasen, I began to wonder how Lana Bastašić would be received in Germany. I mean, I knew of this enthusiasm among my friends, but our friendship circles are really peculiar. There are these people who are in the know. Of course, they would love Lana's work, but I was kind of concerned about what would happen outside of these reading publics that I thought were already sort of like attuned to the type of work that Lana Bastašić tried to accomplish in her writing. There's something extremely specific from my vantage point, very post-Yugoslavian about Fang den Hasen. There are quite a lot of references, their moods, their modes of telling that are too peculiar and too particular for the post-Yugoslav context, this very specific geopolitical context, for people outside of this context to encounter it with care. I was very concerned about what readers would do to this. I just want to kind of pause and put the disclaimer out there that Bastašić writes for the world. And Zeinzinger's translation of her writing into German and the accompanying glossary in the novel offers many access points to the text. So it's not that the book wants to be sort of inaccessible for readers who are not attuned to a particular cultural experience. But both the German literary market's enthusiasm, as I found out later, and Bastašić's textual post-Yugoslav specificities still worried me. How would the author be treated by the publisher? What would the press say? Initially it was just like a silly little thought, but then I started to worry a little bit more. And actually at one point, Maha might not remember, I wrote Maha last summer asking her questions. I'm like, what do you think about this? What's going on here? What should we do about this? And some of the sort of concerns that I had back then, I'm articulating today in a new fashion, in a little bit more of a coherent fashion for you all today. So my worry about Lana Bastašić on the German literary market grew stronger with what might otherwise be described by others as a very minor annoyance. And I'd like to begin with this annoyance. And this annoyance snowballed very slowly. So I'll begin with just remarking that for the most part, the critical press, sort of reception culture in Germany, the feuilleton, the reviews of Lana Bastašić's Fang den Hasen were very well received, sort of positive reviews for the most part. One of them is Jörg Platz's review for Deutschlandfunk Kultur from March 16th, 2021. So an otherwise very positive review. I have to say, barely scratched the surface of what the novel offered, but it wasn't a Verriss, right? If you click on the link for the review and you can just type in Jörg Platt, Deutschlandfunk Kultur, Lana Bastašić, you'll find it. It has the following remark about the author's name. This is the annoyance that I started with. I'm going to share a slide, and I only brought with me 2 slides for today, just to keep it a little bit more conversational. Just give me 1 second. So I'll read it for you. Redaktioneller Hinweis: Wir haben den zuvor falsch geschriebenen Namen der Autorin korrigiert. Das Beitragsaudio haben wir gelöscht. So corrected the name of the author, previously misspelled, and we deleted the the audio that accompanied, right? Because it's a radio review. It was a radio review. So I was instantly wondering, and I didn't listen to it. I hadn't accessed the audio before it was deleted. So I was like, what in the world had happened, right? Then my sort of concern snowballed, I told you, right? So then I hectically started looking all over the websites for any sort of trace of her mistreatment. And I kind of like my inner Bosnian auntie or mommy came out, and I wanted to protect this person who I never met personally, but I felt very sort of protective about. And so the next couple of things started to come into view for me. Here you'll see the website screenshots from the Fischer Verlag, which published both of her books. You have, the name of the author, the title of the book, and then the name of the translator. But do you notice Bastašić's last name? There is this sort of like discomfort with the letters of the alphabet that require diacritics. They kind of they jump out at you. They like stand out at you. They pop out at you. They kind of don't feel like they belong. And in fact, this happens quite a lot for websites where the sort of normative font had only been envisioned for certain kind of letters. And when you have people's names or words that require different type of lettering, and you want to import them into your sort of like aesthetic repertoire of the website, you also have to import specific typography, borrow letters from other alphabets that are not your standard font in order to articulate the author. And so to me, this kind of added to the original annoyance about the author's name from the Deutschland von Kulturradio. And the Fischer website, kind of encountering these things one after another, really made me kind of initially worried, then concerned, and now really angry at how the author has been treated, especially one that's been kind of cultivating quite a lot of enthusiasm, particularly from the diaspora community. To me, this was just really the first two examples were just the beginning. There's quite a lot more to this, actually, and I won't be able to go into all of the examples, but I do want to articulate kind of give contour to one other example that's going to be really important for some of the analysis that I hope to undertake here. I read the back cover and then the website description for Fang den Hasen. And then, the back cover, there's usually sort of like a little bit of a description, a summary of the book, and maybe even some quotes from people. But for Fang den Hasen, the description, it's just really weird. Usually I don't read these descriptions. They always kind of annoy me and they kind of like throw me off from my own sort of engagement with the text. But because I had been sort of like sutured into this cultural concern around Lana Bastašić and how she's treated, I was very deliberate about making sure to read every like extra textual component that is associated with her. So the background, the back cover described the novel, which is a sort of road trip text that traces the protagonist's journey from Dublin to Mostar to Wien. And it called this gesture ein Roadtrip in Europas Herz der Finsternis. And I was like, what in the world does a road trip from Dublin to Mostar to Wien have to do with the Congo, And for me, this is where I kind of feel the framing for this talk series is so incredibly appropriate for the work that I hope to undertake with regard to Lana Bastašić's presence on the German literary market. For me, these types of perhaps otherwise minor irritations to Bastašić's presence in the program for her publisher, the Fischer Verlag, and the German literary field are part of a much larger trajectory. And this trajectory links them to her ultimate disassociation with both the publisher, Fischer Verlag, and the German literary field as such in the aftermath of her Palestinian solidarity initiatives. Bastašić, as some of you know, canceled her contract with Fischer earlier this year, in fact, January 2024, over the publisher's decided silence over the unfolding genocide and epistemicide in Palestine. This gesture drew quite a lot of resentment from the German literary field. Bastašić was cast by pundits as the embodiment of the impolitic in Germany's memory cultural landscape. So one day she was a literary darling, and another day she was the embodiment of the impolitic. But this dominant framing of her as a writer and public intellectual does not form an end to her work's valence in our current cultural landscape. In fact, the irritable standing that Bastašić maintained on the German literary market forms generative sites for engagement for me. This engagement simultaneously casts a critical look at the German literary market dynamic, and it offers different ways to think about the role of literary solidarity and literary engagement as we think about more just futures together. From this vantage point, the trajectory shows that Bastašić, or other writers like her, even in translation and as once literary darling, was always just in and never part of the German literature or the sort of institution that it might espouse to. But that this position does not exclude intimate and engaging reading practices with her work that continue today and will continue into the future. And I'll articulate some of these ideas in a little bit more detail as I progress in my talk. My ideas about Bastašić are informed by queer of color critique, post-colonial and anti-imperial discourse and practice. And I'd like to share a few of these here by way of anticipating my reading of Van den Hazen, which is going to be the sort of main side of which I'd like to kind of, provide a little bit more contour about some of the ideas that I introduced just moments ago. And the first place for me usually when I work on literary studies is an incredible writer. Some of you are very intimately familiar with her work, and those of you who are not, I highly recommend you take a moment and check out Sara Ahmed's work, particular her magnificent 2006 book, Queer Phenomenology, where she notes how racializing dynamics produce orientations. They produce modes of feeling in the world. And these discipline us to sense the normalizing effects of structural whiteness. Ahmed draws on Fanon when she proclaims, I quote, "You can feel the categories that you fail to inhabit. They're sources of discomfort," end quote. The diacritics example I cited earlier, where Bastašić's name feels pressured by the typography, the imported letters from another font, produces an occasion where the normative order of the Fischer or the Deutschlandfunk Kultur websites give rise to discomfort. They discomfort the reader, and here they discomforted me. But in so doing, they carry information that could help us think about the position of the author and her work in this really bizarre literary house that is German literature, where the furniture to hold authors like Bastašić is too jagged and too painful to sit in. Of note here is that Bastašić is a white-presenting person. And while racialization as a system of power most certainly is omnipresent in our world, this analytic alone cannot account for the dynamic at play in the Bastašić example. And here I'd like to cue in the publisher's likening of Van den Hazen to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the Finsternis. The Yugoslav and post-Yugoslav region has always been cast as the periphery of Europe. At its best, that is. At its worst, the region generally demarks for Euro hegemony that which is not Europe. As such, the Orientalist gaze that Central European hegemony casts on the Balkans has had a very long history, ranging from at least the Ottoman era to today. The Balkans are what Maria Todorova has called an area that served as, I quote, a repository of negative characteristics against which a positive and self-congratulatory image of Europe and the West has been constructed, end quote. As such, the Balkanism underlying the West-Balkan relation describes a condition akin to colonization, yet different from colonization. To unpack this, I'd like to turn to Anca Parluvescu and Manuela Boatka's 2022 magnificent study, Creolizing the Modern. I highly recommend this book, in particular for those of you who are interested in sort of imperial, post-imperial studies. I'd like to consult this book actually to help me unpack this idea of how the West-Balkan relation describes a condition that is akin to colonization, yet different from colonization. They describe the European East, and this is applicable to the Southeast as well, as, I quote, geographically European by 20th century standards, yet culturally alien by definition. It is like the Orient, the East, that is. It has conveniently absorbed the political, ideological, and cultural tensions of neighboring regions. Yet its existence exempted the West from charges of racism, colonialism, Eurocentrism, and Christian intolerance, end quote. The inter-imperial analysis of post-colonial and semi-peripheral contexts, such as the East or the Southeast of Europe, proves very instructive for my purpose. It helps us to understand how a text such as that by a Bosnian writer discussing diasporic relationality in a post-Yugoslav world can be likened by Bastašić's publisher to a famous racist text espousing a troubled anti-colonial fantasy. There's a great way from the hegemonic perspective of the so-called West to view Bastašić as absolutely conveniently positioned in the same sort of discursive space as Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I'm going to turn to Van den Hazen to talk a little bit about the novel and how some of these ideas kind of position a very troubled reading from the vantage point of her publisher. Don't look as troubled from the vantage point of sort of readers such as myself and sort of from within the diaspora who engage the text. Van den Hazen is, in Sascha Stanisics' words, a Plädoyer gegen den Eskapismus. It is a road trip novel, but not a magical one that helps you forget your own world in favor of another. It doesn't pull you in to kind of facilitate an uncritical escapism. For readers such as me, whose own life in the Bosnian diaspora is marked by very similar pains to those articulated in the novel, the journey of the protagonist Sarah from Ireland to Austria via Bosnia is not merely cute. It shakes us to the core. Sarah has lived in Dublin for years. She's employed, is in a relationship, and has a job. There's a life in Dublin for her, and it is a variety of life she had always hoped to reach, one which is away from Bosnia, from what she describes as a sort of darkness that hovers over her childhood and teenage years growing up. As a daughter of a Serbian police chief in Banja Luka during and in the aftermath of the war, a town and region marked by inter-ethnic tension that resulted in severe ostracization and death of the Bosnian Muslim population there. Sarah's transformative years have been marked by a tumultuous relationship to Leila, her best friend growing up. Leila is a Bosnian Muslim whose brother succumbs to the inter-ethnic tensions, and her family is ostracized in the community, notably also by Sarah's parents. Following an argument, Sarah and Leila stop talking to one another. We find ourselves 10 years later after this argument at the beginning of the novel, where Sarah is now in Ireland and gets a phone call from Leila. Leila says she found her brother in Vienna and asks Sarah to drive her there from Mostar, where the latter works in an Orientalist-themed restaurant. The entire setup turns out to be a ruse by the end of the novel, and I'm so sorry to be a spoiler here, but it's really important for my analysis. Where it turns out that Leila seeks to, among other things, renegotiate her relationship to Sarah, as much as she might be desiring a reconnection with her brother. She had no clue of her brother's whereabouts, in fact, by the time we make it to Vienna. Over the course of the novel, readers struggle along with the protagonists and their relational struggles that intensify from Mostar to Jajce to Banja Luka to Wien. For instance, Sarah is nervous to return home. She's scared of the language she would face there, which she leaves behind, and is not sure what sorts of language there will be for her now in her current place, where she feels that she's a different person than she was in the past. She has this apprehension about using the mother tongue from within the diaspora, which feels very daunting to her as a practice, as a linguistic practice. With each moment, Sarah, who's by profession a writer and translator, so kind of like a master of language, struggles to wield and control her linguistic past, present, and future. This dissociation from the language, but also broadly from Bosnia itself, does not feel good to her as she wanted it to feel good when she left Bosnia, right? Like she wanted to leave Bosnia, so there must be a sort of like good feeling of leaving this behind. In fact, this sort of disassociation is a great source of pain for her, and figuring out why it still hurts is part of this journey that the novel traces for us as readers. Sarah also finds herself stuck in situations, really stuck in situations. She's stuck professionally, I think. She's stuck financially, relationally. She's stuck within border regimes and many other sort of like related social and political configurations. And this stuckness itself characterizes the discomforting mood in some of the scenes. Readers attune to this mood of stuckness as Sarah, as a character narrator, relays her own sense of stuckness. In this regard, when Leila shows up out of nowhere, meaning the phone call rings one day in Dublin for Sarah and pulls her back to Bosnia, it sort of brings Sarah on a move. It might initially feel like she is being unstuck, sort of unmoored from some of the sort of things that burden her. But and this gesture might, in the end, liberate her in some way. But the novel never gives us this feeling, this pull. So Lila's pulling Sarah from Dublin back into Bosnia is too jarring for the character and also for readers who are experiencing this. And it's in a way confining in its own way. There's quite a lot of scenes in a car where Sarah feels stuck on this road trip in this confined space, even though they're on this sort of like open road and away from any things that burden her. So there's quite a lot of associations with the affective moods of stuckness that the novel performs for us. In one of the novel's temporal interludes, this is a second example I want to cite, which are really masterfully executed. If you've read the novel, you know I'm talking about. Each chapter kind of like travels between past and present. We learn about Leila's ethnic traumas. In order to navigate life in a context that is not suited for her, she and her mother change their names. Leila becomes Leila, and the change of letters carries quite a lot of meaning, very sort of deliberate meaning. I'm not here going to go into the detail and sort of like comparison of Lana Bastašić's typographic issues and some of the topography and active sort of like undoing and redoing of identities through letters, but there is definitely more to be said about that. So Leila undergoes a sort of ethnic transformation from Muslim to Orthodox Christian, from Bosniak to Serbian. No matter if the transformation itself does not latch on around them, like right, like they're in this sort of closely knit community where everyone knows everything about one another. The sort of like Leila and her mom are really coolly optimistic about it, and they kind of pursue these attempts to realize this transformation, which casts the severity of their survival situation to very sharp relief for readers. And again, particularly those of us who are from the diaspora. These types of moments of linguistic and cultural alienation on the one hand, and ethnic disidentification on the other, ring very familiar to many of us struggling to navigate life in the diaspora. Van den Hazen thus enacts a deeply personal reading practice through which a sort of intimacy is produced between reader and a text. So me and a person writing it. This intimacy is very messy and is very flawed and multi-directional, but it offers a way to feel a kinship with the writer and the figures in the novel. One quick tangent with regard to my own personal family history. My last name is Malakaj. My grandfather is from Kosovo, and when he hoped to enter Yugoslavia, like he was crossing the borders in order to get to Yugoslavia. His original name was Malaki with a Y at the end, and in order to enter, to sort of cross the border, he had to actually change his name because the border guards would not let him into the country, because they didn't have the sort of like linguistic repertoire, the typographic repertoire in order to let him. So one of the reasons why my last name is Malakaj with an AJ at the end is because of a very similar sort of modification of ethnic markers, linguistic textual markers in order to kind of like make yourself available and ready for a context that ultimately does not want to have you there. So for me, this text facilitates a very particular kind of kinship with a writer and the figures in the novel. And its kinship is based on an existential instability that haunts the post-Yugoslav diaspora, whose struggles are always marked by an active link to the war in the 1990s and the diaspora population's attempt to repress this past. The darkness above Sarah, and there are quite a lot of scenes in the novel where this darkness kind of just like pops up, in particular in Bosnia, signals this push and pull to the past in a sort of like really complicated affective realities that she faces as a result of it. When Bastašić severed ties with Fischer and gave up on what is likely a very handsome contract for a writer in general, Germany counts as a very sort of financially lucrative market for writers for the most part. I'm speaking very generally here. I know these things vary, but the type of contract that she would have gotten would have been a really substantial one. She did so from within the same spirit of navigating and negotiating the post-war Yugoslav socio-political landscape articulated in her debut novel Fang den Hasen. Sarah and Leila's courage to confront their struggles, to be in relation with one another, cast solidarities as very messy, as irritating, as challenging, but very inevitable social formations. There's an inevitability to Sarah and Leila's reunion. And it's in this spirit, this sort of like inevitable but challenging solidarity, the spirit that Bastašić, a person deeply familiar with political fragmentation, ethno-nationalism, and genocidal ethnic cleansing, expresses solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians. For me, as a child whose Muslim family fled the violence of the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s to seek refuge in Germany, and facing their deportation that ultimately brought my family to the United States, reading Bastašić is a prompt for these very similar types of messy yet inevitable multi-directional solidarities. So knowing about her fate on a German literary market, where her texts were in and not off Germany, then belongs to a very intimate reading practice in which the personal and political find new articulations for me, but also for quite a lot of others. From Bosnia to Palestine, from genocide to genocide, from diaspora to diaspora, the struggle is unfolding before us and we must confront it. Bastašić's literature and her public work around it are a masterclass in how to go about it. I'd like to thank you for listening to my thoughts about Bastašić that I'm hoping to articulate into a longer project. And I'd like to thank the wonderful, wonderful hosts who agreed to be in conversation with me.
Thank you very much, Ervin. I'm not so quick, and usually I cannot find those applauding hands immediately like the virtual ones, but I have the privilege of being able to applaud in another way for now. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for your talk. I remember whenever I was given a chance to introduce the series, I used to always say, I try to create disorder as much as I can. I try to look where can I find some order, and I try to bring some disorder into that. And I'm very grateful to have found many people who joined the game in a way, because all the examples of what you've mentioned of Lana Bastašić creating discomfort and some kind of from a very hegemonic vision, it sounds like disorder. And from different perspectives, it would be solidarity. And it's interesting to think of solidarity as disorder then. And if I may add one example to those that you've already given, like with the spelling of the name, with the reviews, with the spelling of the name on the publisher's website, and so on and so forth. As far as I am aware, there has not been any single conversation with her in Germany about the decision to withdraw the contract. There was no public conversation, like no one was curious to take it further and to try to engage with her in a conversation, whether to ask or to clarify or to discuss more, which is also partly one of the reasons why her decision was sometimes given as a distorted, the reasons and the statement have been given in a distorted way. So I think it even adds one further layer, if I may. Also, no one in the press also engaged in a conversation with her directly to take this further, you know. I'll briefly say how things are going to go now. We have something like 15 minutes that are open for a conversation. You may put your questions into the Q&A mode, or in German, it's F und A, Frage und Antwort. Please type them in. Anna and I are happy to start with the first questions, but we are also happy to leave the forum to other people to join us in a conversation with Ervin. If I may, I would go back to the beginning of your talk, Ervin, if I may, because I'm curious about something that you've mentioned there. You were talking about something like this discomfort right from the beginning. You were worried, you said, all the time. Just like, you know, like it's a literary text, it's being translated. There were very positive reviews. The first one by Sasha, or one of the first ones in Germany by Sasha Stanisic was an extremely positive one. And still there was this sense of being worried from your side. And you were talking about something specifically post-Yugoslavian about the texts. I'm curious to hear a bit more about that. If you could maybe talk us through some examples.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that. I love I knew you would focus in on this sort of worry, because I have this, I think I talked to you about it in another context. I have this kind of like anti-relation to some of these figures, these cultural figures, in particular from the former Yugoslav space, who kind of make it in the intellectual and cultural sphere outside, right? The little broad, like not just in the diaspora, but like when they make it into the whatever might be considered the mainstream. There's so many obstacles for writers and for cultural figures from my sort of cultural background to make it to whatever that mainstream might be, that when they do make it, it kind of becomes this astonishing feat. And when they're there, I mean, I have the same thing with some really established figures, and I don't know why, like Alexander Hamilton, I'm always worried what people will say about him and how people might encounter his work. And I instantly go on this sort of like defense, just simply as a result of this sort of history that these people have faced in making it to a market, whatever that market might be. I felt this sort of sense to also a kind of like an urgent need to be worried too, because I know the German feuilleton and its violence toward people from different backgrounds, despite this kind of like wounded attachment to it, where I hate it, but I read it all the time. And I think knowing the discourse, I was at all times actually expecting somebody to come out and just be absolutely horrific with regard to their reading experience of it. I anticipated some bizarre pop feminist readings too of the text, because there is this sort of like girl culture, sort of two old friends on a road trip trying to figure things out, and I was scared that the sort of like pop feminist takes might flatten an otherwise really complicated travel journey. I was concerned about some of the sort of like bizarre colonial gazing toward people from the post-Yugoslav sphere. That was definitely present, but not in a sort of like overt, but in a covert practice in some of the reviews. It's sort of like Bastašić's use of darkness as a sort of metaphor in particular. I don't know why everyone instantly needs to go towards a sort of association with racialization, but that's what ended up happening quite a lot. And so I was very concerned about that. And I myself felt the need as a Germanist to write about her, which felt really bizarre because I felt I wasn't quite ready and I needed to do quite a lot more reading about it. So here we are. Like this was the sort of like my first place where I'm showing some of the homework that I've been doing on her, trying to intervene, trying to legitimize some of the work that she's doing, and in particular in the aftermath of her severing her ties with Fischer, trying to make sure that she is still recognized for the work that she had accomplished. I think she's an amazing writer, one of the most important figures on the sort of like international writerly scene, and she deserves that. With regard to some of the sort of mentions, the sort of like very post-Yugoslav specificities. Maybe I'll just give one example because I'm scared of my being long-winded. There's quite a lot of mention of one of my favorite dishes from back home, which is pita. So this sort of like savory hand pie type of rolled dough, and there are different kinds. And the character Sarah eats quite a lot of pita throughout her journey, and it becomes this kind of like coping mechanism for the really stressful situations in which she's in. So some of the situations, when you kind of read them, the scenarios, these vignettes, they come across as extremely serious, but then there are these like moments that also call attention to a really bizarre, perhaps misplaced, from a certain vantage point, misplaced humor that comes through the sort of like relation to food and the sort of like compulsive eating and really stressful situations. And to me, that felt so incredibly specific, where this very challenging, ominous, moody situation, difficult moody situation kind of gets cut through with this out of nowhere tiny little joke. And to me, that felt very, very intentional, but in a way that kind of resonates with some of the cultural experiences that might be associated with the sort of like post-Yugoslav diaspora. That's just one example. It's a silly one, but it actually it's punctuated throughout, it punctuates the text throughout.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass the microphone to Anna, and I see there is a question in the Q&A, so I'll follow Anna's contribution with that one.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the insightful talk. I was specifically fascinated by this comparison with A Heart of Darkness that I hadn't heard about before. So my question is going to be about maybe the limits of comparisons, or also the problematic tendencies of them. I mean, comparisons are very often understood to help us understand things, or also maybe in the literary field to create legitimacy, like to compare someone to an established writer, for example. But comparisons definitely have their limits, or yeah, as you've shown with the comparison of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, they can be really, really problematic. And another comparison that I have read about, or that I have often heard mentioned with regard to Fang den Hasen, is Elena una ferrante. So the Neapolitan Quartet, because it's also about female friendship, and this is then linked to Sarah and Leila. And have you thought about this comparison at all? And if so, what do you make of it?
Thanks so much. I appreciate your calling attention to it, because that was initially a really important moment for my interest in kind of like writing about this. In particular, because of this sort of established practice. There's a history of, you know, and I'm going to use a shorthand here, of orientalization of particular kind of cultural practice that might come from within this sort of post-Yugoslav space, or during or pre-Yugoslav space, like this need to kind of rely onto these geopolitical relationalities that have been marked by imperial, inter-imperial, post-imperial, and perhaps even related to colonial sort of relationalities of sort of like Central Europe, Southeast Europe, sort of extractionist relation, but never sort of real meaningful relation in terms of cultural exchange. And so I kind of, when I first saw that, it was like an instant sort of invitation to like, we must resist this, we must articulate it. And with me, I mean, I felt like the personal need that I need to attend to this. I think the intertextual moments in this novel are just so incredibly rich and wonderful, and the Ferrante is just one example of it. The book literally has a sort of like epigraph that's a quote from Alice in Wonderland. So Lewis Carroll had been it's a really important intertextual friend to Van den Haasen, and quite a lot of the sort of in particular the sort of the associative energies of darkness that are articulated in a text actually are Carrollian, so like Alice in Wonderland sort of related, and not Conrad. So there are all these other intertextual relations that could have been established and belabored, but they were not, at least not in this sort of like marketing technique for the novel. But you're right, these were drawn out a little bit in some of the critical reception of it. And Zasha Stanisic actually was one of the people who very much kind of articulated the more sort of positive associations. So the point about how comparison can be a legitimatizing factor is super interesting, because then the question is, for whom? And I think this is part of this, why I love this sort of series, this sort of Kanonkritische Angehensweise, or like the canon critical perspective on it, that sort of like established legitimatizing orders in a book market, in the sort of Maha was talking about Betrieb of literature. They, to me, are very suspect precisely because they rely on these established narratives, which for a very long time have cast certain literature in a certain kind of way. They've both enabled this literature, perhaps and might actually condition certain types of readings of this literature on the market. Maybe that there lies a portion of the enthusiasm of the literary darling Lana Bastašić. But I think it's faulty, right? Because her texts are ultimately much more complicated than that. And there are these other comparisons and these other conversation partners, Ferrante, Carroll, but then also a host of Yugoslav, post-Yugoslav writers who kind of get activated throughout the text that basically could give us an occasion to talk about this text for days, weeks, hours, months. And it's such a richness to it. And I think it's flattened when some of these established procedures by which to legitimatize a debut novel in particular in translation get deployed. For the better or for worse. I mean, and that's the question. Was this text so widely received precisely because of these framing mechanisms, or was it received because of other things? And I think it'll be really interesting to kind of pursue these questions. So if anyone here or in the audience is interested in kind of collaborating on this, I really want to write more about this. And it'll be cool to get other people on board who bring different vantage points to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are two questions in the chat, and both are fascinating questions. So I'd like to take both, which will make us go a bit beyond the hour. I hope this is okay for everyone. Oya Demirci, I hope I'm not misspelling or mispronouncing the name. Thank you for the detailed background of the novel. I'm wondering if the Dublin experience of the character involves a dialogue with people who have experience with the Troubles in Ireland. Living not in Belfast, but in Dublin, there might still be some impact on the interior involvement of the character.
Oh my God, I love this question. I'm trying to process it. I'll say a couple of things, and I don't know if I'll be able to fully address the richness of it. It's a great question. I think Bastašić herself, there's a sort of autobiographical component to it. She spent some time there. But there is definitely a sort of like commentary on class, and so I think it's actually mostly focalized through Sarah and her experiences. We don't get too much engagement with sort of Ireland as such, other than through some of the few remarks about the challenges she faced getting into college, because this character gets accepted into what she calls, of the 8 master's programs in literature, the worst one in Ireland. And that's her sort of ticket out of Bosnia. So that's how she gets out of Bosnia. Then she's in a relationship with an Irish dude too. So there's there are these like moments, but it doesn't actually quite come close to a little bit more of the sort of like solidarity struggle that might potentially lie there between the sort of like North Ireland struggle of this Bosnian, and that took place at there's a sort of contemporaneity to some of these geopolitical struggles. Of course, the setting of the character in Ireland itself could be viewed as sort of meaningful here, but I think your question is a really, really good one, and I might need to like reread. We might need to revisit the text and close read for that. But I think that's an excellent critical interrogation of what's happening.
Thank you very much. Oh, I see there are David Gramling is asking. I guess what first strikes me about the typography and promotion paratexts you shared with us is their profound onlineness, and therefore their apparently infinite malleability, iterativity, editability, alleged ephemerality. If Bastašić were being promoted primarily in print and not online, the presses would more likely have quality checked the font, etc. Maybe they would have been foregone a silly. They would have even foregone a silly tagline like "Herr Steffenstennis," because it would be out there in print forever rather than revocable when criticized. Are presses just more willing to do these stupid things because they're online? More generally, what do you think of the messy onlineness of these features?
I think I like this question. So a couple of thoughts. First, ein Roadtrip in Europas Herz der Finsternis is on the back cover of every single book, and it's printed there. And it's very prominently, figured there. And so that kind of brings that association, in particular, my sort of critical reading of it, in very sort of like sharply, like there's an urgency to undertake it. But I think the point that you're making about the typography online and its messiness there is well taken, because that is not replicated in the print in the same fashion. The matter that I'm quite interested in is that Fischer is a multi-million euro, if not more, publishing house that has a lot of money and a lot of capacity, and ostensibly Lana Bastašić is not the only author with a diacritic in it, and yet this. So I'm not going after smaller like self-made websites or like small initiatives that can't sort of within their own capacity figure this out. This is a huge establishment that has kind of maintained this relation to this sort of diacritics, not just with this author, but others for quite some time. It's really weird. And I think to me, it becomes a site for critical engagement with the seriousness with which they want to kind of market these writers. Names are a very personal matter, as you know. And so I think that the author's sort of relation to the publishing house, to me, and her sort of irritable standing with regards to it, kind of begins there. Like, was it ever a home that was comforting? And, you know, as you know, I'm very much inspired by Sarah Ahmed's sort of queer phenomenology, and she talks about tables and chairs, you know, like when you sit down. So what do you, when you sit, like some bodies just don't work with all furniture. And so if that furniture in that house is not made for Bastašić and others like her. But I think the matter of sort of messiness, online messiness, super interesting. I'd love to think a little bit more about that. Decidedly, it's not a social media space where people can say whatever they want to, right? Like it's a major publisher in the European context, and the teams that go in, like there's a huge set of like people that are working with that are employed by this publisher, and quality control is part of it. That's really bizarre that's not even an issue, right? I like that though. Thanks, David. Kisses.
I hate to interrupt the discussion, so I won't. And if I may, I will take the two more questions that are in the chat. But then after that, I would leave it at this point, and the conversation will have to continue some other way. I mean, you're inviting already people to collaborate on things. Claudia Junke is asking, thank you very much for the talk, especially the reflections on literature and translation, the narratives they carry with them, the ways they contribute to and may challenge the different target cultures. I would be interested in knowing more about the author's reception in other languages or cultures. Is it different to the German?
This is a fantastic question. I would here require a team again. So if you all want to join my little Forschungskolleg to Lana Bastašić, but just briefly, I know of her reception in a sort of Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Montenegrin language context, and from what I gather, in particular the people that I engage with, a lot of whom are academics and artists, intellectuals, etc., it's really well received. So she does have this sort of like standing, at least I think, in a sort of in her sort of like home context, but also in the diaspora context. I think it's for the most part sort of like a well-received status. But then Maha, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you also told me about Bastašić's sort of presence in particular. I think you were talking about Egyptian news, if I'm not mistaken, that, you know, in particular in the aftermath of her severing her contract, Bastašić was all over the news in quite a lot of sort of like Maghrebi and like Middle East contexts. And that's quite astonishing. I just don't know what the reception of her is with regard to her literary writing. I think the sort of like political gesture itself might have received a really kind of like prominent response, but I don't know about the literary one. Not to put you on a spot, Maha, only if you want to respond to it. But Claudia, that's a great question.
Yeah, I don't want to take the space from the next questions, but I was just mentioning briefly to Ervin once that actually there was a very, like I was saying in the beginning, that German media did not care to elaborate further or engage in a conversation about what Bastašić did, but I did indeed read in Arabic media. I think there were 2 articles that took Bastašić's story or action further and discussed it within a frame of solidarity and so on and so forth. Edin Basic is asking a question, and again, I apologize if this is a mispronunciation of the name. Wonderful talk. Since you mentioned specifically Muslim contexts around Bastašić's work and the Bosnian War, could I ask you about how that was received in Germany? Do you see in Germany any inklings of what Reza Zia Ibrahimi has called denial of Islamophobia? I think there is a continuation, and the next part is not a different question, but rather draws on that one. I'm thinking of related cases like France, where any writers who talk about Islamophobia face immediate counter arguments that Islamophobia doesn't really exist, that criticism of Islam may be salutary, and that there is no real discrimination against Muslims since everyone is equal. Are there familiar patterns in German debates, either around Bastašić or other writers touching on the war in Bosnia? Are there Islamophobic aspects of these debates in Germany? thank you very much, Ervin, for the questions.
Thanks, Edin. It's so nice to see you. Oh my gosh, there's so much to be said about this. I don't think Sasha Stanisic even actually brings up some of the intra-ethnic tensions in his review of it, which I think is really remarkable, but also it might have been strategic to kind of prime the novel for a particular kind of readership. Sorry, Sasha, if he's listening. It was really strange to me that the reception culture of the novel barely addressed this tension between the two protagonists. It's a huge tension, and that actually might go back to another example of Maha, the sort of like Yugoslav specific. You were asking for very specific kind of examples. The author doesn't come out, and the narrator, so it's a character narrator, Sarah, does not articulate these sort of like ethnic differences are explicitly. They're slowly introduced through markers of the everyday that people in the cultural context, if they were sort of like socialized in this cultural context, would be able to recognize as such. And that did not really come through in a debate. And I think it's not because it's not present. I think people really avoided this conversation at the end. So like the matter of the sort of like denial is, there's a certain kind of avoidance culture that patterns the discussion of the novel. Oh my God, this is like a whole new chapter, like related, but there's quite a lot that could be said about it. This isn't to say that the reviews and the sort of reception overall were just shit, like, in fact, I think for the most part, she was very well received, or this novel's reception was fairly positive. It's just it was very surface level. And I think focused more on form, which deserves all its praise, than I think it focused on some of the contextual and geopolitical commentaries. And the political potentiality of the novel, I think, got a little bit lost in the form, which for me, in the discussion of the form, which for me is you cannot pull the one apart from the other, because some of the sort of formal experimentation that she undertakes with regard to sort of the time lapses between the present and the past absolutely are patterned around these aspects of inter-ethnic tensions that are just like so omnipresent in every aspect of Yugoslav and post-Yugoslav life. But the matter of sort of the denial of Islamophobia comment, I think there's quite a lot more to be said about it. She's a really politically astute intellectual and writer, and so these matters are absolutely part and parcel of her work. And I think it actually comes to the fore much more crassly in Mane Mond or Mliečni Zubi, so the collection of short stories, which is I actually wanted to write about it too, but I'm too distant, too much information. I don't have access to my therapist here while in Germany, so I could not engage with the text, which broke me when I read it in the type of detail that I needed to, whereas Fangenhazen was a little bit more approachable, but I highly recommend it. The sort of political dimensionality in particular with its relation to literary form comes to the fore so much crassly there. Thank you so much, Edin. Those are great questions.
Thank you very much, Ervin. I feel like there are way more questions to ask. I'm sure not just Anna and I would engage for way longer with you in this conversation, but I feel others would feel very intrigued to join us as well. So thank you very much for opening up this space. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about kinships yet, but I mean, we could see how collaborative and collective discussions and exchange of thoughts and ideas lead to different, like we're opening new spaces and new paths for thinking. Thank you very much for the talk and for such a rich and engaging discussion. And I wish to, before I make two announcements, say I'm very grateful to Anna for facilitating everything and making it possible to collaborate on this today. I think reading against the canon or trying to look into what is made invisible can only work if with this kind of collaborative framework. So I'm very grateful for you, Anna, for making it possible this evening. Thank you very much for that. The last two things to mention are two announcements. Next week on the 13th of June, The event series is going to be broadcasting live from Amsterdam, from the Goethe Institute. So if you're happy, you're welcome to, we're happy and you're welcome to join us via Zoom and log in to join us for a conversation together with Laila Essa. Laila Essa is going to be the co-host, and we're hosting John Ciopolizzi and Talia Ostendorf for a talk on disrupting translation. We're taking the disruption as what has become a buzzword recently, and we're going to tackle things around translation and around translating authors, Black authors and authors of color, or in general marginalized authors. This is on the 13th, and on the 18th of June, there is going to be the next meeting with Meet the Author, Hohe Femme, whose novel Wo auch immer ihr seid is going to be discussed with us. By the way, also an author whose name, while being spelled on websites and so on, does indeed lead to certain, I would call them accidents, where the spelling is also not that easy, it seems. So just to say, join us next week and the week after on the 13th and the 18th. And many, many thanks for being here. As always, most grateful to the team of the Goethe Institute for making sure that everything goes the way, goes just to the right direction. Thank you very much for being here, for assisting us, and good evening towards everyone, or perhaps have a good day, everyone, and see you within other contexts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.